Presentation is from Hannah Jen on the topic of postmodernism.
I would like to begin this thesis with a very serious question, one that sparked great controversy from the moment it was formulated. The question at hand? Is Pluto a planet? While this question's relevancy may seem completely non-existent, there is a surprisingly close connection between Pluto and postmodernism. It all has to do with the question, is there any objective truth? The contention's simple enough. Up until 2006, it was a scientific fact that Pluto was a planet. However, the dreaded reclassification of Pluto seems to have changed the facts, and thus changed the truth along with it. How are we to reconcile the seeming contradiction between Pluto's former planetary status and current non-planetary status? Because of Pluto, it seems as though we have reached a conclusion in which truth is relative to ever-changing human society. While there are many fallacies in this logic, this premise stumbles into one of the core tenets of postmodern philosophy. If all human understanding of truth is based upon arbitrarily assigned categories, when those categories morph over time, wouldn't truth logically change along with them? Postmodernism takes this implication and drives it to its logical conclusion. The purpose of this thesis is to analyze and critique postmodernism from its philosophical roots and social implications. It seeks to determine whether postmodernism's rejection of absolute truth can still allow it to provide a logically consistent, coherent, and usable worldview. In order to understand postmodernism, one must first understand modernism, as it is primarily characterized as a reaction to that movement. Modernism's defining aspects were its rejection of the notion of God and its elevation of the individual as the center of reality. Its goal was to find a singular, rational framework for understanding reality, one to replace the supposedly faulty one of religious belief. It was this framework of knowledge that could provide solutions to the world's problems and ensure human progress. In essence, modernism assumed that human reason was capable of discovering objective truth without the influence of divine revelation. However, the onslaught of death and destruction brought by the world wars and the Holocaust, coupled with the threat of annihilation from the Cold War, sparked a drastic shift away from modernity. In an increasingly senseless world, it was clear that modernism could not provide an answer. A new philosophy was necessary. This budding rejection of modernity's core principles paved the way for postmodernism to emerge. The word was first cemented as a term of cultural analysis when used in a report by Jean-Francois Lyotard. In that report, he defined postmodernism as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. Meta-narratives, which he understands as a comprehensive explanation of all human experience based upon a universal truth, are no longer a viable option to believe in. As this mood of pessimism settled further throughout Europe, a set of theories that came to define postmodern philosophy came into being. These main theories cover three main areas: language, power, and truth. All of them conclude something about reality. First, the theory of deconstructionism, as purported by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, deals with language. It asserts that there is no objective meaning within the structure of a text. Rather, meaning is created only once a reader engages with the text. Therefore, a text has as many meanings as it does readers, as there are no objective connections between language and meaning. Other philosophers of postmodernism applied this approach to reality. Just like a text will be read differently, reality will be read differently by every self that approaches it. Secondly, theory of power knowledge adds to this by giving it a moral twist. As purported by Michel Foucault, every interpretation of reality is an assertion of power because knowledge is always the result of the use of power. He claimed, quote, "Power and knowledge directly imply one another," unquote. For postmodernists, power structures within language determine the framework for reality and truth. Thirdly, the theory of pragmatic truth, as purported by Richard Rorty, claimed that truth is whatever works out best. Because he assumed that language is a mediator between humans and reality, instead of a way to describe objective reality, truth is merely a matter of social convention. Thus, truth is not determined by the metaphysical, but by what one's community determines is the truth. These theories sum up the general beliefs of postmodern philosophy. They conclude that reality is nothing more than human construction, and truth is created by cultural context. Long gone is the modern quest to find a unified grasp of objective reality. In the eyes of postmodernists, there is no center to reality or truth, but only a courtyard of different interpretations. Most glaringly, postmodernism is characterized by a lack of center. Humanity has nothing to appeal to as a collective whole for objective morality, truth, or judgment. All of this culminates into what postmodern philosophy is best known for being: a philosophy that is founded upon relative truth and morality. With this information, this thesis will now proceed to critique postmodernism as both a philosophy and a social worldview. By rejecting the concept of absolute truth, postmodernism fails to provide a logically consistent, coherent, and usable worldview. To establish a basis for critique, a few logical principles must be laid out. Beliefs must be consistent, non-contradictory, and able to apply their principles to themselves. This thesis will demonstrate that postmodernism is unable to satisfactorily hold to any of these principles consistently. First, postmodernism is logically untenable as a philosophy because it refutes itself by using contradictory reasoning. One of postmodernism's major problems is its inability to maintain its position consistently while abiding by its own principles. And the most obvious example of this logical inconsistency is postmodernism's rejection of any sort of narrative, meta-narrative, while being a meta-narrative itself. As defined earlier by Lyotard, a meta-narrative is any comprehensive or overarching explanation for human reality. This definition is crucial because postmodernism is primarily characterized as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. However, there is a clear paradox here. Just like the statement, there is no objective truth, is itself an objective truth, the belief that humanity should move beyond an absolute explanation is itself an absolute explanation. If someone asks you to disregard all objective truth, the first thing you must ask is, why should their truth be followed absolutely? Like every other worldview, postmodernists assume that their way of viewing truth should be held as a comprehensive framework for understanding human existence. But the irony is that their comprehensive framework is that there should be no comprehensive framework. While postmodernists assert that meta-narratives should be disregarded with skepticism, that very belief is a meta-narrative, as they assume their belief must apply to all situations. Similarly, the theory of deconstructionism cannot abide by its own principles. While Derrida and other postmodernists claim that deconstructionism has no true definition, they still describe it as an assertion that there is no objective meaning behind any language. There is a clear issue here. Deconstructionism must be objectively communicated by language. Otherwise, there would be no comprehensible way to hold to the theory. If one says, there is no objective meaning to this statement, why should anyone take its words at face value? According to deconstructionism, any interpretation, even contradictory ones, would be just as valid in their own way. There must be some inherent reality to the idea that there is no inherent meaning to a text. Foucault's view of power and knowledge also has internal contradictions. If all knowledge is a form of asserting power, then Foucault's knowledge must also be an attempt to exercise power. At the very least, his exhortation to reject truths presented by institutions seems to be a veiled attempt to establish his own authority. Why should Foucault's view be taken as authoritative when he provides no real basis for why his contention is exempt from scrutiny? Likewise, the pragmatic view of truth must also answer to these principles. While Rorty and postmodernists assert that truth is whatever works out best, this has no real basis. Just like all the previous theories, this one must be justified by its own principles, namely that it is a theory that works out the best. Ironically, workability presumes some kind of value judgment, which in turn presumes the existence of some kind of value. It is nearly impossible to claim that something can work out if there is nothing to constitute what working out is. Ultimately, the only way to claim that humanity does not have access to reality is to have had access to that grand reality. How can one make a claim against objectivity without being objective? Secondly, postmodernism's logical inconsistencies have a deeper, more practical implication. Because it rejects absolute truth and meaning, postmodernism cannot be lived out consistently without contradicting its core principles, moral issues, or personal unfulfillment. Postmodernism cannot be practically lived out without contradictions that reject its very core beliefs. For example, postmodernists emphasize tolerance, the acceptance of all relative views, and the incompetence of logic. However, if these principles were fully followed, postmodernists technically should not be able to use logic to prove themselves universally right. They would be unable to point out contradictions in viewpoints they disagree with. Most consequentially, they would be unable to claim that views that contradict their own are incorrect, as they believe that all interpretations are valid in their own way. If postmodernism is carried out to its logical conclusion, clear communication should be nearly impossible to accomplish. A centralist and subjective reality ensures that there is no such thing as misinterpretation. Despite this, postmodernists continue to write to make their meaning known, and they still complain about being misrepresented. It seems as though their core beliefs disintegrate once carried out in the real world. Furthermore, postmodernism's belief in moral relativism creates social issues that prevent its own goals from being accomplished. While postmodernists hold that most universally recognized moral values should be followed, they would claim that these are culturally decided morals. However, what happens when a community holds to the opposite of these moral values? A prime example of such a community would be World War II Nazi Germany. If the view of those in power had been enlarged, would that cruelty have been morally acceptable? There seem to be only two possible responses to this situation. First, that cruelty was not wrong for that particular community, and second, that it was wrong because all of humanity opposes cruelty. The first answer is not something most postmodernists would admit, and the second seems to be appealing to some kind of moral value. From this tension arises the question of tolerance. While tolerance is a core tenet of postmodern thinking, there have been communities that have held intolerance as a central value, such as religious extremist groups. Postmodernism faces a similar dilemma here. Either tolerance is an inherent aspect of cultural relativism, which would make it a universal value, or it isn't, which means that postmodernism cannot even hold to one of its central values. Either way, postmodernism does not provide an adequate solution to either dilemma. Furthermore, because of its moral relativism, postmodernism undermines serious moral debate and reform, two of its greatest goals. Much of the social justice that postmodernism claims to deliver relies upon having some kind of standard regarding society's wrongs. For example, the civil rights movement must be grounded upon the value of human rights in order to hold any weight. However, postmodernism's lack of absolute truths and morality essentially erases all basis for value judgment. This effectively blocks any real progress to be made for many minority groups that postmodernism claims to benefit. Finally, because of its lack of absolute truths, postmodernism is unable to provide ultimate human fulfillment. One of the most pressing implications of a lack of belief in transcendent truth is that humanity has no ultimate meaning. Because there exists nothing beyond text and interpretation, they fundamentally have no meaning outside of context, and thus they contain no real hope. If humanity has shown itself to be ready and willing to create mass destruction, then even created meaning doesn't offer much of a solution. Postmodernism offers no real hope for overcoming guilt, evil, and suffering. It cannot satisfy our longing for ultimate justice and morality. Proponents of postmodernism may counter with defenses to the arguments presented in this thesis. They may ask, how can you critique postmodernism using traditional logic when postmodernism assumes that these principles are not universally valid? While presuppositional differences regarding logic are often wrongly overlooked, it is slightly absurd to assert that logic is not universally valid, especially when it is used by postmodernists themselves. Humans cannot rationally believe in explicitly contradictory things. Even postmodern philosophers do not actually believe that both contradictory statements can be equally simultaneously true, as they continue to refute opposing views. If they really held that both their view and the opposing view were equally valid, then there would be no good reason to object to any of your opposing views. From this, it could be ascertained that postmodernists as a whole do not actually reject a logic that holds that belief should be consistent and non-contradictory. Thus, since they use this type of logic, they are subject to being critiqued by it as well. Another common issue postmodernists have taken with much opposing criticism has been the supposed misrepresentation of postmodernism. They might ask, how can you critique postmodernism as a whole when it holds that nothing can be universally defined? There are a few issues with using the broadness of postmodernism to evade criticism. First, if postmodernism's ability to be understood as a cohesive worldview and movement is obscure at best, how can one expect a regular person to hold to a postmodern worldview? Even Ihab Hassan, a famous postmodern scholar, confesses that, quote, still today, no consensus obtains on what postmodernism really is, unquote. If there is still much internal debate over what postmodernism is, how can postmodernism be considered a stable and reliable worldview? How can one hold to something that he cannot define? Secondly, for a movement that refuses to define itself, it has quite a few objections as to who or what can be considered postmodern. If truth is inaccessible, why should postmodernism be trusted more than other views? Postmodernism should not be allowed to play a game of whack-a-mole, evading criticism just because of its sheer scope. Its lack of cohesiveness and clarity only goes to further show that it is a bankrupt and unsustainable worldview. Finally, postmodernists often reject that meta-narratives are essential for living a fulfilling human life. They might ask, if humans do not need meaning to live well, why would anyone need transcendent meaning or truth? While humans can survive without absolute truth or values, the question is not whether humans can live without meaning. Rather, it is whether humans should settle for living under a worldview that cannot provide purpose during suffering. Not only does a lack of moral absolutes guarantee that all human lives, no matter how much good or bad they have done, will end in the same way, it fails to provide a safety net for when non-transcendent meaning is destroyed. Humans can seek meaning in family and friends, but what happens when those relationships break and humans die? Humans can put all their efforts into trying to make the world a better place, but what happens when they are confronted with real evil and suffering that can never seem to stop multiplying? The issue with grounding one's purpose in created meaning is the fact that humans are limited. They are contingent on powers outside of themselves. They can try to create their own meaning, but that meaning is so easily taken away. This thesis has shown that postmodernism's inability to maintain an internally consistent system of beliefs and to fill its own self-reported goals prevents it from providing a logically socially tenable worldview. Because of postmodernism's inherently self-contradictory nature, it fails to provide a belief system that can benefit anyone who follows it. Its blatant disregard for meaning, logic, and objective truth only contributes to its inability to act as a stable and practical worldview. Postmodernism, in short, is logically, morally, and socially bankrupt. Is Pluto a planet? As of now, the answer still remains no. But does that mean truth is relative to human-defined categories? As this thesis is argued, the answer is also an emphatic no. The dangers of embracing moral relativism and relative truth has become increasingly clear, especially in the world of today. This is why Christians must be able and willing to study and engage with postmodernism in a culture that is still greatly influenced by it, even though people may not be aware of the illogicality and impracticality of their own assumptions. Truth is not what is better for us to believe. Even more so, it is important to recognize that embracing postmodernism leads to a lack of hope. As Christians, we realize that there is hope and meaning that transcends all human boundaries. There is a good and perfect creator who has not only defined reality, but who has defined a purpose for all of humanity. Most importantly, there is the promise that no matter what horrors happen on this earth, there will one day come a day where a Savior will make all things new again.